after passage of years, there is always a more objective look back,
That's right.
without ideology,
No, that's right, yeah. That's
blood and tears, and more. One of the best jokes about Russia communism was in Georgia. There was an application from a would-be student from Albania, and the dean asked him, "How is your Albanian?" Just joking, because he submitted a transcript. Different subjects. And one of them was, it was many years ago, was scientific communism. There was such a thing. And the dean said, it's an oxymoron.
That's right.
We have all kinds of cookies and
There is no scientific.
Yeah, well,
How are you doing?
Beer looks great.
Thank you. Compliments. Yeah, that's fine.
I don't have an extra like one. Do you also prefer, I guess, no, and Russian?
Hey, how are you?
Well, for what
Life okay?
moving along slowly. It's a biography of Volkovano.
I think I thought you'd have one by now.
No, I have one. I have two. Use them traveling, and you wear them all the time.
Well, I'm traveling also. You're second. I go to Oklahoma.
Oh, okay. Very
Security is very heightened. Have to allow documents.
It's wonderful, wonderful. Because the orc was very interesting. And also DC by itself is like outstanding. You've been
I work every day.
I'm not sure if it's changed a lot. But
I have one.
probably changed, but
There are several that one is favorite. It's used to have it like 10 years. I washed it so many times, and it's still, you know,
the most
especially if you're not serious, especially at the airport, to park and cross it, you just take it off with all the documents and everything.
usually waiting for that. She was very impressed.
Just when I got hungry, I think I got two more.
Yeah, she gets complaints. She was
Exactly this one. The same company, the same brand, that now they're kind of Hungarian.
I don't know. The first show we took it for something. Probably
In some basement in Turkey or in
Folks, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming today. Brownbag, it's great to see such a great turnout. I want to thank everybody who took part in the mixer on Friday night. It was a good time had by all, I think, and we were very happy with everybody who came and talked to us. I also want to tell you, before we introduce our speaker, about a couple of upcoming events. We have our first film that we're going to be showing right here in 318. It's a Turkish film this Friday. So that's 7 through 9, and then I want to make sure that everybody's aware that Victor Yushchenko is coming to campus. He's going to be talking at the Dole Center on Monday. I'm sure that Alex is going to be seeing his face up there as well. So should be really, really interesting. That happens at 7:30 at the Dole Center. And then on Thursday, September 22nd, we've got the Bacchus Memorial Lecture with Timothy Snyder speaking about his book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. Our speaker today is Holly Nielson. She's Senior Funds Counsel of Vostok Capital Partners. She has over 20 years of experience in corporate and finance law, more than 12 years of experience living and working in Moscow. Although you're working from Kansas City at this point. She has also taken part in the Harvard University project, working as a senior advisor to the chairman of the Russian Securities Commission from 1995 until 1997. And she also took part in the creation of the first Russian investment fund in 1984. So, and, of course, she's a KU law grad. Going to talk to us about Russian commercial law.
Well, thanks for sharing your lunch with me. And it's nice that it's kind of a small, informal group and we can sit around. I hope you don't mind my sitting rather than standing, but I think it makes for a better discussion. So I can talk for about 30 minutes and then we can discuss and you can ask questions. I hope you'll have a lot of them. But I also would love for you to interject with questions as we go along. It looks like this group has lots of different experiences. And so please feel free to ask questions as we go along. I prefer to have a lively discussion rather than just sit here and talk about my experiences. I think one of the most important things that Bart said is that I'm a 1982 KU law school grad. And so I remember when New Green Hall was really new. And at that time, we had no international classes. I mean, I think we had one Kansas City lawyer who used to come on Saturday mornings and do a seminar on international transactions, which I unfortunately never took and knew very few people who did. I mean, the world is very different today, and it's changed enormously in those 30 years. Companies are multinational now, and the globe is a very small place. And the law school now has some very noted professors in international subjects, both international public and private law. But I feel very fortunate to have kind of evolved in this way, rather than perhaps deciding at the outset that I was going to do international work. As Bart said, I've had the good fortune to live and work in Moscow for more than 20 years. I mean, I got there in January 1992, and still am working with Russia today, though for the last year and for the foreseeable future I'll do it remotely from Kansas City, which is nice for me at this point in my life. But working there as a lawyer has given me a really historic view of the transition in lots of different respects, sociologically, economically, but also because of my practice in law, I've been able to watch as this new legal system developed and what its interaction was with the new economy that was developing and the way transactions were done. And that's, I guess, what I'd like to focus on today, is just that incredible dynamism between the birth of a new democracy and commercial system and the legal framework that developed. And sometimes it developed in response to what was going on in the country, and a lot of times, I think much to my satisfaction, it kind of led the way, and it was important in how the new Russian economy developed. For me, and for Russia, the first attempt at a commercial law was in November 1987. And at that time, the Soviet Union adopted what was the first joint venture law. And that in that law, it allowed foreign investment for the first time up to a 49% interest in a joint venture. And I had the good fortune at that time to be working for a law firm in Houston, Texas. And the first companies, because of the natural resources, obviously, that were in the Soviet Union and in particular in Russia, the very first companies to begin taking advantage of that joint venture law were the energy companies. And a lot of those were based in Houston, Texas. And I happened to be in Houston with a large law firm doing real estate and oil and gas and corporate work. So I was able, both because of an interest and some language skills I had begun to develop in college in the mid-70s, was able to take advantage of that and begin to work with people like Exxon and Pennzoil and Dresser and some of these companies as they began to look at doing business in the Soviet Union. It was very rudimentary joint venture kinds of business back then, but as you know, the world continued to change on a very fast track. And so in December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved after the Berlin Wall had come down, and we had 13 countries instead of the Soviet Union. And it then, of course, began to change very quickly to a democracy and a market-based economy. But because of that joint venture law, some of what I think of as the early international law firms, people like Baker McKenzie, Couder Brothers, those who really specialized, and there were only a handful at that time, and law firms were not very international back then. And those law firms began to set up offices in the late 80s in Moscow. Couder Brothers, via a guy named Richard Dean, was the first. Baker McKenzie very quickly after them, and then another handful of law firms. So I was able in January 1992 with the law firm that I was with in Houston, because of this oil and gas business that was beginning to develop, able to go to Moscow. And then shortly thereafter we decided to set up an office, and now there are probably about 40 or 50 different, primarily American and British law firms that are in Moscow, but other nationalities as well. So it all began with that first joint venture law. And people always say to me, well, you know, was there law in the Soviet Union? And the answer is, of course, there was a very well-developed body of law and various codes of law. But they had no relevance, and there was no basis for either a democratic or a commercial system. The laws that were in place for many decades in the Soviet Union were there to support a planned, state-owned, communist economy and political system. So there were, for instance, there was no private property. People had rights to apartments, and people had rights to dacha and perhaps the land under them, but there was really, with a few very minor exceptions, there was no private property. The means for production were all owned by the state. There really was no retail service to speak of. Foreign trade was organized through the foreign trade organizations. And there was no commercial, no private commercial activity. So obviously no laws to support that. And in fact, the laws that did relate to that said you may not. So again, there was a very well-developed system of legal system, but not one for private commerce or democracy, for that matter, of course. There was full employment, but very little freedom, and of course the borders were very closed and were very controlled. So after the Soviet Union dissolved and these 13 states were set up, there were some very important and very, very rudimentary changes that happened in March 1992. And again, I was kind of fortunate to get there in January 1992. So I feel very grateful for seeing essentially the first 20 years of this particular development. But in March of 1992, when Russia decided it would be democratic and it would have a market-based economy, a fellow by the name of Gaidar decided that there were some very basic things that needed to happen first. Quite a smart fellow, and took about 5 decisions that just overnight completely changed the face of the country, and Moscow in particular. So again, in March 1992, I'm sorry if I said 82, March 92, commerce became legal. You could engage in private commerce without being put in jail. Prices were floated. The Soviet Union had set very arbitrary pricing, which made no sense from a demand and supply sort of perspective, so that people could actually make profit rather than having prices controlled. The currency was liberalized. The ruble up to that point had been kept at sort of 1 to 1 to the dollar. And that had no basis in a market economy. So the ruble was allowed to float, which was a terribly controversial decision because people's savings bank accounts were wiped out overnight. In the end, there was really little else to do, but that was a terribly difficult decision. And borders were opened. For the first time, private import and export activity was allowed. And those 4 or 5 decisions, as I said, just changed the face of the country overnight. And what you began to see by about February was long lines, miles of lines of people literally standing on the sidewalk, holding an item in each hand to sell. It was a very desperate time. As I like to say to people, imagine waking up and having someone say to you, you know, we're sorry, we promised something different, but the system is, you know, 180 degrees today. We don't really know that it's going to work. We wish you good luck. We're not going to take care of you for the rest of your life, and good luck. And so 1992, 1993 was a really very difficult period, but you began to see the blossoming of commerce, and people were selling things. Most of the, you know, what had been state shops or state restaurants, or even some of the early privately owned restaurants, kind of all, for the most part, went out of business, and it was very dark on the streets. But then there were these signs of private commerce. First, people standing, holding items. Then you would see very kind of nicely marketed card tables, and then, you know, some really badly manufactured kiosks began to appear on every street corner, and there were exchange offices again on every corner for exchanging currency. People became very savvy about exchanging currency to try to arbitrage. And people began to rent apartments. One of the very first privatization efforts was in the housing stock. And that happened very quickly in 1992. And it was interesting, you know, how kind of quickly people took to commerce and really understood what they were doing. And so with very little paperwork and effort and no money, you could go down to, you know, the sort of the city hall, if you will, or the municipal offices, and privatize your apartment. And people did that very quickly. And within months, 80–90% of the housing stock was privatized. And then people began to rent out their apartments, sublease their apartments, and do various things to earn money. So again, that was one of the very early changes. The next thing that began to happen was an effort to privatize the commercial economy. The housing stock had been a very quick and successful privatization effort. And the next thing that needed to happen was to privatize the corporate commercial system. All of these state-owned companies needed to be put into private hands. And as most of you know, I'm sure, having studied the privatization effort in Russia, it's not without its controversy either. And that was something that was very much led by people, but also laws. The law on privatization is not a very complicated, certainly not a very long law in terms of its page length. As I recall, it's maybe even 15 pages. And a fellow named Chubais really spearheaded that effort. And Chubais's philosophy at the time was that it needed to be done quickly, that there was going to be a very short window of political will, and if privatization didn't happen quickly, it wouldn't happen at all, or it wouldn't happen at all, basically. A lot of people took issue with that. There are countries like China that have done it very, very differently. And there were certainly a number of people arguing at the time that what Russia needed to do was get these companies in shape to be able to privatize them in a way that maximized their value, in a way that Western Europe had privatized the decades before. And again, the argument on the other side was, if we don't do it now, it will never happen. So this law, 15-page law on privatization, was adopted, pushed through the parliament really quite quickly. And from 1992 until 1994, there was a very relatively fast process of voucher privatization. That was interesting from a lot of different respects. The vouchers, which were given to each citizen, was a relatively democratic process. It was interesting in a very, very primitive securities or capital market sense, because these vouchers were tradable and their prices weren't set. So you had what developed into a very active capital market, or they were a security. They were, by every definition, a security. And what I always found very interesting and odd, but seemed to kind of be a harbinger of everything else to come, was that they were never restricted in terms of who could buy them. Foreigners could buy them, just like Russians could buy them. There was a very freely tradable market in them. Prices weren't set. It was an incredibly open, level playing field for everyone, including foreigners. And that's the way the market, in my experience, developed after that, which is completely different from the way, for instance, China has developed. In China, you have lots of restrictions on foreign investment. You have Class A shares for Chinese and Class B shares for foreigners, and it's been a very restricted market. Most people are very surprised to hear that Russia, from day one, has been a really very open, level playing field for foreign investment as well as domestic investment. And I think that kind of all goes back to voucher privatization. There were different ways to privatize. The employees of a company, together with management, could privatize. That became what's called insider privatization, because the employees needed the cash, didn't really understand what was going on. The managers, who were a little bit more savvy, were able to say, you know, let me hold your vouchers in trust, and we'll have this employee-owned company. And that, of course, then led to insider privatization. And the people who had been the directors of these companies during the state period continued to be the directors of these companies, and people would call them the red directors, because essentially, because of the way privatization was carried out, it was very much an insider privatization, and to some extent pretty corrupt. But overnight, again, at least in you know, time as most of us think of it, in 2 years anyway, the economy went from 0% privately owned to 70% privately owned. And that's pretty incredible. We can all debate whether Chubais and others made the right decision, but you know, it's in some respects, I think it's kind of hard to argue, because I'm not sure it would have been any less corrupt, and I tend to agree with him that it may not have happened if it hadn't happened pretty quickly. But the problem with that then was that you had these companies, as they were privatized either by their employees or in auctions. There were also auctions, which again sort of mimicked a capital market or a securities market, and gave people an early experience in trading platforms, and then kind of led to the capital markets development. The other thing that is interesting about this time, and the price issue, the pricing, and the way prices were allowed to float and import and export were allowed to happen, is that you also saw during this period from about 91 to 94, 95, a lot of incredible entrepreneurial activity. You know, if you were 30, 40, 50, 60, and you had mouths to feed at home, and, you know, a job that you were worried about, or you were, you know, out in the middle of Siberia somewhere, you know, it was a very, very, very difficult time. But if you were 18, 20, 25, and a child of perestroika, and, you know, not as concerned and not with as many responsibilities, it was a time of incredible opportunity. And I think that's why today you see, you know, CEOs of Russian companies who tend to be about 35 years old. But there was a lot of entrepreneurial activity, and the early entrepreneurial activity that allowed some of these very wealthy oligarchs like Berezovsky and Gazinsky and Potanin and Tarkovsky to develop the wealth that they did, as well as the experience that they did, was arbitrage between domestic prices and foreign prices. There were a handful of people who understood that while the domestic economy was still heavily subsidized, they could sell things, especially natural resources, on the external market for prices that were 3, 4, 20 times what they could buy them for in Russia. And so you saw a lot of people amass a lot of wealth. But there was also a lot of very positive, healthy entrepreneurial activity that took place, and a lot of amassing of wealth by people who I think deserved it. One of my favorite stories was working with a couple of entrepreneurs from St. Petersburg who during that time realized that abroad people drank juice out of these packs that a company called Tetra Pak would produce. And in Russia, it might have come out of a machine, or maybe it came out of a bottle or whatever, and wasn't pasteurized and wouldn't sit on the shelf for as long. And anyway, these very, very young entrepreneurs did a deal with Tetra Pak to buy the product, set up a very simple factory, and 10 years later had the #2 juice business in Russia that they sold to Coca-Cola about 4 years ago for multi-millions of dollars. So there was a lot of that. The mobile phone companies are another great example. It's just no one had a landline. People were waiting 10 and 20 years to get a landline, and overnight everybody had 3 cell phones. This infrastructure for cell phones was very, very fast to set up. And all of that was sort of happening during this very kind of paranoid but primitive and in a healthy way privatization period of 92, 94. Post-privatization, you had all these new companies that were in private hands and no commercial legal system. So there was another sort of period of racing against the clock from about 94, 95, really until the crash of the ruble in 98, when this incredible, very complicated and, in my view, very good legal system got put on the books. And there were lots of technical aid projects. There were lots of Russian institutes that got into this business. And essentially they looked around the world and figured out what the corporate laws were, what the securities laws were, what the tax laws were, and began to develop a commercial legal system, and had the ability, had to do it very quickly, but had the ability to look at what worked and what didn't work in other parts of the world, to work with foreign advisors. And for example, the Russian joint stock company law today, I think, takes the best from corporate law everywhere, and is frankly much better than what we have in Delaware or Texas or Kansas or Missouri. It's really a very well thought out and well working joint stock company law that has much more minority shareholder protection than what you find in lots of other local corporate laws. Probably the greatest success in terms of law that had a huge impact was the reform of the tax law. In the very early days, when the Russians needed some form of state revenue and had to, knew that they needed to tax their citizens, they kind of looked around the world, and instead of rationalizing it, but perhaps predictably at the time, because it had to be done so quickly, they sort of, they went, profits, VAT, and they took every possible tax law that they found around the world and they adopted them, and all of a sudden you found that everybody had to work in the gray market, because if you reported your earnings as a company from your business activity, you'd be paying about 140% tax. So it didn't work, and that unfortunately made for a system for years where everyone had to avoid taxes in rather malicious schemes, and then led on down the line to people being able to be prosecuted for that. I can tell you that 100% of the people doing business activity in the early 90s were doing it in some sort of gray way. But finally, by about 1995 till about 97, 98, the Ministry of Finance had a very brilliant guy named Shatalov, who had the time over over the course of about 3 or 4 or 5 years to really better study the tax laws and how they worked rather than just what they were, and was able then to adopt in 3 different parts a new tax code. And Russia today has the lowest corporate tax rate in Europe. It has the lowest individual tax rate in Europe, which is 13%. If I do my Russian tax return, it's 5 pages, not 5 inches. And it's a huge, huge, not only advantage, but betterment, I suppose, of what we have in the U.S. for tax law. We talk about tax reform today, and you know, we ought to take a look at what Russia did about 5 or 6 years ago. And it made an enormous difference because all of a sudden, overnight, everybody became compliant. Individuals, companies, because it was, instead of all the energy that went into avoiding tax and offshore pricing schemes and all kinds of things, if you were paying 13% as an individual or 23% as a company, it made more sense to pay that and use your energy in other ways. So almost overnight, the federal budget, tax revenues went up about tenfold, and people really, in the matter of years, became tax compliant.
What year was that when they became compliant?
Well, I think it's probably about 96, 97 when there was a huge change of attitude. There was another step up in that after Hordakovsky got, went to jail because it was the tax avoidance which the Russians were able to use, perhaps selectively, but he certainly had avoided tax, and that was what they were able to use to get him on. The law on securities was adopted in 97, and Russia today has a very dynamic capital market, not one that's considered yet an international exchange. A lot of Russian IPOs are still done in London or even in New York, but it's a very functioning capital market. I said that I would only talk for about 30 minutes, so I'm going to try to wrap up and you can ask me questions. There's just an enormous amount to say. I think the question I get asked today is, does Russia have a rule of law? And my answer to that is that it absolutely has great laws on the books. The task for the last few years and the next few decades is to put those into practice so that they develop, so that people understand and know them. There's been, there needs to be more work in terms of the judiciary being independent and not corrupt. It tends to be difficult if you're out in the regions and at a local court. By the time you get to an appellate court in Moscow or St. Petersburg, the decisions are really quite good. And it's something that's evolving. It's going to take a lot more time. So I guess what I would say is that after the first 10 years, the legal system on the books is great. But it's going to take a while for enforcement and respect for that to develop. But it certainly is very, very different than when I was practicing law and trying to do transactions in the mid-90s or even the late 90s. In Russia. So I'm going to quit talking for a while. If you have specific questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Yeah.
What would you say to the average Russian who saw his or her savings depleted in the early 90s or 1998, and in the average Russian's mind, this loss was aided and abetted by people like yourself from Washington who basically stole their wealth?
Well, I wasn't with the
Okay,
IMF,
okay.
so I'm not going to take credit for
What would you
this.
say to them? Because today, capital flight continues. Many Russians look at capitalism, or what was adopted from the West, democracy, in a negative light. And, you just told us a success story. Russia is now got its capitalism. My sense among average Russians, I don't get that sense of this was a success, and they may not be fully on board in building a market economy or democracy.
Yeah, I mean, as everywhere. It depends on who you talk to, right? Personally, I feel enormously empathetic for people who, it was a very paranoid, a very difficult, and a very unfair time. And I don't think there's any way to get around that. It was a change for which there was no precedent. You were doing it in a country that didn't have the best history in terms of institutions or institutional memory about a market system or democracy or anything else. And so I think the story is still just beginning. And I feel enormously empathetic for people who got caught in the crossfire, as a lot of people did. Now, I have lots of friends who have done very well, who were young, who were energetic, who were smart, who've been able to create businesses, run businesses, and be very, so it depends on who you talk to. There's a huge segment of the population that still lives below the poverty line, and there's an enormous amount of work to be done in that respect. And I think we have a global problem about disparity of income today. I think we have that same problem in the U.S. I think that problem exists in spades in Europe. I think that's what you saw in the Middle East. And it's a big problem in Russia, too, and I would never say that it wasn't. There's a huge disparity between people who are rich and people who have much too little.
You first? Okay. You have drawn a rather positive picture of the development of Russian legal system in finances. But you mentioned about criminalization and the role of former KGB agents, leaders of the party, leaders of Komsomol in this process. And as I understand, their role was not very positive. Those people just grabbed everything they could see, they could find. And even now, like, the current system of Russia has developed because of those processes. And like, criminals and all the criminal activity in Russia played enormous role in the development. So can you kind of comment on this?
I'll try to give you quickly my thoughts about it. And again, I'm not here to say everything's great and everything's rosy. I think there are successes. I think there are huge failures, like in the privatization process, which I generally think is quite positive. The auction of state assets to the oligarchs, sale of shares, was a hugely unfortunate event and the worst part of privatization. So there are lots of very mixed stories, and I'm not here to say it's all rosy, but I do think that you cannot look at what's happened over the last 20 years and say it's all a failure either. I think the cup is half full and the cup is half empty. Now, there are, my very personal experience is that there are two very different economies that happen in Russia. There's the old state economy, which has been privatized to oligarchs and insiders. It's basically the oil and gas and the natural resource economy. And then you have and that's the old economy, right? And you have basically privatized state institutions like Gazprom, which is the oil and gas ministry, okay? That's the old economy. That's the aviation and defense industries, which we just saw a huge tragedy happen as a result of. And then you have the new economy, which is where I prefer to work. And those are the new, smart, young oligarchs who have built the consumer business and the retail businesses, who have built the mobile telephone networks, who have done lots of work in industries that are greenfield, that didn't exist in the old state system. And that's a really dynamic, interesting, and relatively honest part of the economy. It's the old state part of the economy and the administration, the government, basically, the executive branch, where I think and corruption is huge. Corruption is huge. It's a huge tax on the country and on business. Until somebody at the top says we don't support it anymore, it's probably going to be there. And it's It's a nightmare, but you can also do business in Russia and not be a part of that.
And at this period of privatization, this healthy capital, the book value of resource industries, for example, some resource industries, were no greater than a yearly export of oil, for example.
Yeah.
Now, Chubaians and the economists here in the West who were advising them and so on must have known that when the entire reserves can be recovered in one single year of export, it's going to cause an incredible amount of frustration and backlash. In fact,
Of
what
course.
it did. And yet they went around. Some of them, of these captains of industry, they modernized the resort, that in industry. They say Yukos, although I have reservations about Khodorkovsky myself, so I'm serious on level. But others simply were milking it. But when the total export of an industry is equal to the book value of it, then you ought to know that something is out of kilt, and you should not and cannot privatize.
And that sale of shares, that one particular event in which most of the major oil companies were sold to the oligarchs.
Or aluminum or nickel or what, the same thing.
Or else
all the
nickel,
resources.
yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that's the single blackest part of the privatization process. It was horrible, it was absolutely criminalized, it was absolutely unfair. There's no question about it.
It was
But those,
obvious when the yearly export of that
Well-
product is the same as the value of the entire industry.
you know, very corrupt investment bankers came up with the idea for that. And that actually had nothing to, it was a privatization process, but the point of that was to finance Yeltsin's second campaign. So it had a political purpose rather than an economic purpose. And you're right,
Said that.
it was obvious, it was criminalized, it was corrupt, it was horrible. And that's this part of the old economy that I'm talking about. I think there are a lot of very black stories there.
I have a follow-up about privatization and Chubais. One quick comment and another one about taxes. I feel that deep inside you think that if it were not for Chubais, he was criticized for GPOs, for all these vouchers and all that, that if it were not for his energetic effort, probably it would not have happened at all. If people did not have appreciation of the value in private property. How would you comment? Deep inside, do you think personally that...
That's probably the hardest question that I ask myself over and over and over and over and over again. I think it's a really interesting historical question. Deep inside, I think he was probably right. Does that mean, deep inside, I think, and if you look at some of the Central European countries or places like Ukraine is a mess. I mean, we probably have too many people here with interest. In Ukraine's like
Yes.
10, 15 years behind Russia in terms of its economic and political development. And I mean, I think that places where this process was carried out less abruptly have suffered. Does that make it right? I mean, I think there were a lot of very difficult choices at that point in time.
And the second one I have very quick views on VAT, value-added tax. The United States does not have value-added tax. Is it collection there is much more transparent because both the buyer and seller are visible in that sense? How would you comment on that?
Well, the VAT is very much a reflection of the European system, which Russia is a part of. And I think the VAT has not been very problematic except for its rate. Its rate, I think I'm still correct that it's 18%. And that, people keep talking about
They're moving down to
ratcheting that down. The rate has been criticized, but I don't think they've had a particular problem in terms of its collection. It's a relatively fair tax because you can offset VAT that you
Quick
pay.
sideline. Any chance of adopting VAT in the United States?
I doubt it. I don't know.
Okay.
I would like to ask a legal question about Khodorkovsky, and also a reportorial question. convicted again recently with his partner to another, I don't know, 10 years. Some woman in the court, maybe the clerk, had a press interview in which she said that the judge was on the telephone with the Kremlin before he passed the sentence. What do you think of that?
I have very strong personal views about the Hortokowski case, and I think people in the U.S. find it a bit controversial, but was Hortokowski selectively made a case of? Absolutely. Was it selective justice? Absolutely was selective justice. But did he deserve it? I am not a big Hortokowski fan. I watched Hortokowski, number one, steal a lot of state assets. I watched him do very bad things to the depositors in his bank in 1998. I represented the Darts, who were minority foreign investors in his oil company who got screwed. And he did it time after time after time. Every time he had an asset that went bad, somebody else paid for it. And there was a lot of tax evasion, which was what they finally got him on. All of a sudden, he realized that if he was a poster child for good corporate governance after he had gotten his company, that it would increase the value of the company to him, and ultimately he'd sell it for billions of dollars. I mean, I am not a Hortokowski fan. I think there are probably about 1 million different reasons why he ought to be in jail. Did he get selective justice by the Kremlin? Absolutely. But he did, because when Putin came in, he gathered the oligarchs around him soon after his election, and he said, okay, you guys, you stole assets.
We're going to have to just interrupt now. This is a surprise for Bart. Come on in. Bart, this is from all of us who love you. Congratulations. Come on up here.
Sorry, Ollie.
That's okay. This is all for the good.
Hi, Bart. I'm Diane Goddard. I'm from the Provost Office. And I'm here to make you very uncomfortable. I'm here, and I am so pleased to be able to present to you your award as the University Unclassified Staff Employee.
All right.
Yay. Some more, and I'm going to make you listen to some of this, but it won't take very long. Your Crease colleagues inform the Employee Recognition Committee of the superb work that you do, and the committee concurs by recognizing you with this award. This folder contains a biographical sketch detailing your university service. I won't read it because it's quite lengthy. But I'd like to highlight just a few notable details, which I'm sure you're all aware of. You have been assistant to the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies for nearly 3 years, after working in international programs with the School of Business beginning in 2005. At Crease, you balance a number of responsibilities and have been called the nerve center of event programming for the center. You have coordinated and produced all kinds of events and programs from Brownbag series to multi-day scholarly conferences. The 50th anniversary celebration of the founding of Crease that you coordinated in August 2010 was particularly successful and noteworthy. You are appreciated for your networking skills that keeps Crease connected to other institutions, community organizations in the Russian community in Lawrence and the Kansas City area. I have been told that though you show great initiative and can work very independently, you also contribute enormously as a team player. You are known to go beyond what is expected of you in your job and to be enthusiastic in your promotion of the mission of Crease. You've helped expand Crease's reach and impact across Kansas. In addition to my speaking and the biographical sketch that I just summarized, this folder includes the award certificate and a letter from Provost Jeff Vitter telling you that you will receive a $750 award minus the government share.
Yeah.
That 15%, that's pretty good.
That money will eventually show up as a direct deposit. Also, you are a candidate for the Unclassified Employee of the Year, who will be announced at the Employee Recognition Program in May, so you now all have to come. And thank you sincerely for everything you do. Congratulations.
Thank you for those who submitted and who nominated me for this. I really appreciate it. It's a great honor.
There were a lot of us. Okay, we've got lots of food, so hopefully you haven't eaten lunch and you have some more room for bagels and schmear. We got them especially for Bart because we knew he really doesn't like sweet things. So help yourselves. And sorry to barge in on.
No, I'm sorry, no, sorry.
I think you had some cold water. Can we continue? I'm really interested in this.
Here.
We can as soon as everybody starts eating.
Everybody has, this is a brown bag. Put out the bag.
Holly, can you also talk about Browder?
Bill Browder?
Yeah.
Well, I was gonna.
We raised it next to get the food.
Yeah. Yeah.
How are you?
Well, congratulations.
How's law school?
It's tough.
Let's let everybody get to the food and then I'll.
Yep.
Yeah, they probably should. Thank
Yeah, I'll be
you.
back in class at 1:30.
And there's fruit.
Well, I may be coming to.
And that's blueberry, and then I have
Whatever.
and Bart. What flavor do you like? You should see me trying to figure out what.
How useful.
Do you like Asiago?
You know how this has.
No, that is garden veggie. And we got lots of veggies.
Oh, I see.
One and ask her how you can call.
Yeah, I'm using gals or just let me know.
I believe we got the same email, but
I mean, it's not part of the official.
And then there's also blueberry.
All right, well, people, we started talking about controversial Mr. Hordakovsky, who I just have some very strong personal views about, though I also appreciate that it was selective justice. I absolutely appreciate it was selective justice. All of them did it, but what I was about to say is that he committed a second offense, and that second offense was that Putin got all these guys together at the beginning of his term and said, okay, you got your wealth, you got it on, not so great terms, but I'm going to let you keep it if you stay out of politics. Because what was happening at that time was that the oligarchs were claiming they ran the government, not Yeltsin. And Putin said, okay, you stay out of government and I'll stay out of your business. And there was one guy who didn't do that. Everybody else put their heads down and really lived by that agreement. And Hordakovsky did not. And I think, for a lot of different reasons, you can agree with them, you don't agree with them, but I think Putin had to do something when Hordakovsky basically said, I'm going to do what I want to do. He was shipping oil to the U.S. and China. He was telling, he bought off the parliament about, what the natural resource taxes were going to be. I mean, it really was a situation where I think you can justify some action being taken against him. So the other controversial figure we can talk about is Bill Browder, who I don't feel nearly so strongly about. I think Bill is a very good person, good businessman, a very likable kind of guy, but he got to a point where he was taking on fights in maybe a little too high profile a way that everyone knew he was going to get in trouble for. He got a little too righteous and went after political organizations in a way that made himself a target. So I think people feel empathetic for him, but they feel as if he brought on his own demise. And he was doing, and I know personally, he was taking rather aggressive tax positions to benefit himself and his investors and his Hermitage Fund. I know exactly what the Gazprom schemes were. They are things that can be criticized. You know, I always felt as if the tax police and the finance ministry would have a case if they went after him. And I think he just got his head above the parapet a few too many times. And he brought it on himself. Was he a crusader? What do you have a view, Arena?
I do, but I do want to hear from Dr.
This
Sexton.
continuation of this question. The Firestone Duncan law firm, which was actually doing all this legal work for Mr. Browder, are they to blame for something, or they were just blamed with the government and you can't win with it? What's your opinion on the Firestone Duncan?
They were doing what a lot of other people were doing. You know, there was a lot of money to make in Gazprom local shares. And Gazprom floated ADRs on the market for foreign investors. And then they had these local shares, which were restricted to Russian nationals. Foreigners could not buy. But because of that, anytime you restrict markets like that, there's a huge opportunity for profit, right? And so there were a lot of gray schemes set up for essentially foreign investors to profit from Gazprom local shares, and they did. I have a client who made about $2 billion doing that. And Firestone Duncan was helping Hermitage Fund set up exactly those gray schemes. And so, did Firestone Duncan help, assist? Yes, but they were doing it for an hourly fee. They weren't profiting from it. Bill Browder and his investors profited very handsomely from what they knew were terribly aggressive tax positions. And people like Price Waterhouse and Ernst & Young and Deloitte were all kind of advocating and signing off on and pushing these gray schemes and everybody had a hand in it. Everybody knew it was aggressive, and a lot of people made a lot of money doing it, you know? Not institutions, but people like, you know, Bill Browder or the Chandlers or the Darts or other family offices that didn't have sort of the, you know, institutional controls.
So you think Mr. Magnitsky will deserve being in jail?
No, I don't. I absolutely don't think Sergei, and I knew him personally, and I know Jamie Firestone very, very well. No, I think that's a very sad. It's like the young woman lawyer at UCAS, right? Svetlana Bakhmana, who got put in jail. I think it's people who are at lower levels that often get prosecuted.
Third and fourth tier.
Rather than Bill Browder, who's sitting in London doing his Asian business now. So no, I think the Magnitsky thing is tragic.
I sort of see three stages in the last 20 years that kind of overlap. At first, maybe in the early to mid-90s, if you were operating a business in Moscow, you had to pay off the mafia. There was a protection system, or literally in Russian, a roof, right? Krisha. Then, in the mid to late 90s, you had the oligarchs. And that's maybe the two are kind of grafted on top of each other. And then in the 2000s, and both of those stages are kind of volatile, unstable. And then in the 2000s, you have the state being both a Krisha and taking over the oligarchs. And the situation then becomes very much like Imperial Russia, state capitalism. And I think most Russians, to go back to a very early question, I think very few would really like to go back to socialism.
I agree.
I think they're, especially in Moscow. Now,
Everybody's got an invested interest in some way, whether it's traveling or a job or whatever.
In the Rust Belt, I don't know, maybe not quite so decisive, but certainly in the big cities. But I think they also acknowledge that corruption is pervasive. And you can do well in the private enterprise system without celebrating it philosophically. You know, if I can get ahead, great. So to kind of get what you can, I think. Right.
Well, I think that's a little bit of Russian nature, right? I mean, I think you know, we can talk about the Russian character, and I think some of that is just kind of endemic in Russian character. But there is no question that corruption is endemic. There is no question that people use administrative resources for bad purposes. It's a very rough, raw, difficult business environment. It is also a place where Pricewaterhouse, United Technology, McDonald's, and about hundreds of other companies that I can name do business honestly and more profitably than any other place in the world. I mean, it continues to be this land of extremes, right? Whether it's extremes of income or extremes of honesty and corruption. I mean, it's a place where there's all kinds of kind of conundrums and disparities and extremes. But it is a place that's possible to do business in an honest, uncorrupted fashion, or you can be part of that portion of the system that's very corrupted. And it's harder to do business there. It's harder to avoid the corruption, but it is possible. And Procter & Gamble would tell you General Electric and lots of others, they are more profitable in Russia than they are any other country in the world. They've got to be in China because it's a bigger market, but they're more profitable in Russia. And they do it in an uncorrupt way. It is sometimes hard. It is sometimes hard to believe. But let me make one other point, and this is one of the things that frustrates me most about being back in the U.S. And that is that people like Mr. Hodorkovsky, or Mr. Berezovsky, or Bill Browder have spent millions of dollars on public relations in the U.S. And it's worked. It's worked.
Has Hodorkovsky got money in the U.S.?
He has spent millions of dollars. He was selling oil in the U.S. right before he was jailed. That was one of the things that the Kremlin didn't like. He was saying, I don't really care whether you want me to sell oil and gas in the U.S., I'm going to do it anyway. And I think there is a legacy of the Cold War that continues. There's no doubt about that. But also the public relations that people have undertaken here has worked to a great extent. And I don't think, as I said before, I'm not here to say it's rosy, it's great, it's all good, it's all bad. But I do find, number one, that people in the U.S. are less informed about Russia than people in Europe are. I find